I graciously called Jonathan a few months ago and said, would you like to come celebrate the anniversary of the Center on U.S. China Relations? And by the way, could you also sing for your supper? He said, fine, as long as I don't have to make any predictions. And would it be okay if we mainly focused on the 17th century? So, we're not going to go that far back, but I did want to
We're going to go further.
I guess we might go a little further. I wanted to just start by saying a word about how we came to be here. So when I first started studying with Jonathan 22 years ago, not that distant past, one of the things that I learned was that in history, cause and effect can be quite slippery. And if you're trying to figure out why did a war start or why did an election turn out a certain way, and you're a historian, you gather information, you sift through it, you read and you reread, and in the end, often you only have a hunch. And in Jonathan's case, it's usually a pretty compelling hunch, but it's still a hunch. There isn't that much certainty that you can hold on to. In the case of my own interest in China, that's an exception to this rule, because I know with a great deal of certainty that if I had not walked into a classroom in New Haven 22 years ago and heard Jonathan give a lecture, I wouldn't be here. Or if he had been lecturing on Russia or Liechtenstein or Timbuktu, we wouldn't be here. And this was in the mid-'90s. Not that many Americans cared that much about China. I certainly didn't. But Jonathan did, and it was incredibly contagious. And so I came back for the next lecture and the next lecture, and I read his 15 books. Maybe it was more like 12 at the time.
Well,
but
that's
eventually.
Secret repetition.
and begged him to become my advisor, and then eventually went to China and developed my own relationship. But basically everything that I've done since then, as a journalist, as a student of history, even my marriage, I owe to that first hour of. I met my husband.
Frank group. I was told this.
I owe to that first hour of listening to Jonathan speak. So I thought we would begin by. I was just going to ask him how he came to have devoted his life to China. Jonathan was raised in England. And as a young man, he was a student poet. He spent time in the British military in Germany, and then he arrived at Clare College at Cambridge with the aspiration to become a novelist and signed up to study British political history. So what happened? How did you wind up on China?
I think it's something to do with prolonged ignorance on my part. It's amazing how little there was in terms of China studies in Europe as a whole, where the Scandinavian sinologists, I think, were staking out major claims, and a rare graduate student from the States was a very exciting thing. And I can still remember how the ordinary sort of afternoons beer drinking slowly became a more rowdy part of the London scene, and sort of showed us not only that we could read the sequence of somebody I've always admired, John Fairbank, and most of us here in some way or another were touched by Fairbank regardless of politics. But he would be one of a few sort of strong names with a lot of visibility.
And you came to Yale.
I came to Yale with all that Gothic, and also with Arthur Wright and Mary Wright, which was very important to me, and I think I know here that it's popular still to think about them. It took me a long time to realize how much was known in England, but it was of a very traditional sinological variety. And we were encouraged to work just about to the edge of our ability and further in a sense.
And so you met Mary and Arthur Wright, who were teaching Chinese
They were both
religion
teaching at Yale, the grand years, as they say, yes, with a great deal of originality and a great deal of eclecticism. And it's something that's very hard to teach to students, but it is the importance of evasion and the looking for emblems. In fact, I hadn't had a chance to ask you today, but I was wondering if it was a false memory or not, that among the first students I ever worked with in modern China, you ended a wonderful essay with the water in the rain, in a rainstorm, with the paradox being how did you write about China, and at the same time how do you deal with emotionally and aesthetically.
That was the beginning of my. That was really nice that you remember that. That was the beginning of my
22-year memory.
That was the beginning of my senior essay, which began with a scene of W.H. Auden and Christopher Isherwood arriving on a Chinese boat to what was then the temporary wartime capital of Wuhan, after Nanjing had been invaded by the Japanese. And they were in this terrible storm, kind of trying to make sense of what they saw.
Yeah, the way my mind works, which is rather slowly, is that something like that 20, 30 seconds, probably enfolds several extraordinary books if one could have the time and the energy and would really keep going, which I couldn't after a certain event. It takes a lot out of you.
Do you want to say anything about when you were at Yale and you first began to get your hands on Chinese documents with Mr. Fong?
Yes. I've always treasured the friendships with Chinese research scholars, as well as researchers and those in other areas. I had a sort of an amazing luck, which should not be mocked at, and that introduced me and told me that there was much more space than I'd realized for Chinese history. And I had the good fortune not only for Mary and Arthur Wright in the Western League, so to speak, and there in the other leagues were a stream of really innovative scholars who were doing everything from arcane Buddhism to really quite advanced economic studies and economic theories. And I couldn't believe that it wasn't being studied and examined ceaselessly or every day by people, because it was so interesting. But why was it interesting? And I've gone back, I'm afraid, a bit in Chinese studies. Now I really like the 1560s. And one can shift around if one wishes. One has enormous space for maneuver. You have lots of goodwill. I should mention at least Mr. Fang Zhaoying, who was my tutor for a year in Canberra, in Australia, and it was a wonderful place for exploring. But I'd like to turn that on its head a little bit. What about you being lured away from history into legal studies and law? Or do you miss practicing law? Or would you somehow link it more dramatically with your writing on history?
So fortunately, I didn't. My husband is the lawyer in the family, but I have come back and forth in my career between journalism and the study of history. I was at Time magazine for many years in China, and then Jonathan lured me back to Yale to study Qing dynasty history with him, which I did until I got a call from Orville saying, you want to take a little leave of absence from graduate school and come to the Asia Society. So, I think that there are a lot of similarities between good journalism and good historical scholarship. The techniques are pretty similar. Obviously, you're working with live people in one instance and mostly with non-alive people in the other one. But, the basic techniques are similar. You find facts, factual information, you verify it as best you can. You try to balance abstraction with what's solid, and then you tell a good story. But I think where things get complicated in both disciplines is when it comes to interpretation and how do you think about how to place an event that you're writing about as a journalist in the right historical context.
Right.
And so when I came back to Yale to study history, I often found myself thinking about how I would have told the stories that I wrote at Time differently if I had had a different frame of time or a different frame of space. And I think there's a pretty strong tendency among Western observers of China and also people within China, including the Chinese leadership, to describe China as a monolith, politically, culturally, geographically, and to think of China as this kind of timeless place, or to say that things are a certain way because that's in China's cultural DNA. And I think this is a way of looking at the world that obscures more than it reveals. And having studied history with somebody like Jonathan, who is so interested in the dynamics of individual events and the details of individual lives, has deepened my appreciation for journalism that is kind of skeptical of these large generalizations. And so that's really what we try to do with ChinaFile now. But I think in both disciplines there can be these moments when rigorous inquiry crosses into something very different, something more elusive than just gathering and sifting facts. And Jonathan does this better than anyone I know. And so when I was thinking about what we were going to talk about, I remembered a passage that he wrote in one of his early books, which is about a peasant woman in the 17th century named Woman Wang. And Jonathan wrote that when he came to this project, he picked Woman Wang up the way that sometimes you find a stone and you see it shimmering through the water at low tide. And you pick it up almost with regret because you know that in time the colors that suffuse it will fade and disappear as it dries in the sun. And in the case of Woman Wang, he picks up the stone, and not only do the colors not fade, but they grow sharper as he holds it in his hand. And he wrote, I remember, that from time to time he knew that it was the stone itself that was passing on warmth to the living flesh that held it. And that's...
Thank you.
I think that's the ideal that we aspire to, and it's not very easily achieved.
Oh, thanks.
But so I wasn't surprised that when I asked Jonathan to pick one passage from his writing that was something that still felt true to him many years after he wrote it, he chose a passage that is about this process of inquiry and why it's alluring and beguiling and difficult and necessary. And so he's now going to read it, and I'll just give you the quick gloss that it's the preface from his book, Chinese Roundabout, which he wrote in the late 80s, early 90s.
Early 90s.
Early 90s.
And later.
And it's going to be about a man named Gaspar da Cruz, who was a Portuguese Dominican friar who traveled to Guangzhou in the late 16th century and who became the author of the first ever book about China in Europe. So, take it away, John.
I'll take it away, yes. The size of... Sorry? Shall I just let it rip?
You can just let it rip.
I mean, the simplest punchline would be that everything is history. That everything from a smashed up wooden box to a surprising snowfall to an autopsy on an elderly woman in the snow near Suzhou, every conceivable kind of human foible. China is intensely localist. I realize more and more, I feel it more and more, that that's where people of goodwill and ambition are going to, hear more than we ever did before. I found that many of the things that interested me about China are still there. They're just in the flesh, as it were. You can't get out of them. And I was thinking of the warmth from Chinese, just local sort of scribes in Chinese text who nevertheless enrich the way we look at what we're seeing. And one different example would be in a book I did called Treason by the Book, which is, again, we're all treasonous in different ways. We throw things away stupidly, we waste things, we change trajectories in incredible ways. And I wasn't entirely not at all being flippant when I said that 1560 may be more important than 1570.
So read us this so that we can
yes,
enjoy it. It's so wonderful.
This would be from the beginning of Chinese roundabout. And for those who weren't lucky enough to be in roundabout culture, this would be the first line to it. So it takes about two and a half minutes. I hope that's all right.
That's fine.
But my favourite book would be one that I haven't really managed to write yet, which would tell one that there is so much to do, and that leads one to think about local governance and local agriculture and all kinds of bodies of legal practice. China's legal history is astonishingly interesting and gets more and more complex as it goes backwards in time, not the other way around. A fascinating study. And so this is a montage. Everything here is in a text, and every phrase is in a text, but it comes from the 16th century rather than this afternoon or tomorrow. So let me just give you this introduction, and
I think you would just start reading.
I'll just read. It happened one night by moonshine. Gaspar de Cruz recalled of a moment in South China during the winter of 1556 to 1557. That land contains Portuguese sitting on a bench on the river's side by the door of our lodgings, and a few young men along the river in a boat, passing the time, playing on diverse instruments with me, and we being glad to hear the music which they were playing on their boat. We sent for them to come near where we were, and that way we would invite them in to be with us. They, as gallant youths do, came near with their boat and began to tune their instruments in such a sort that we were glad to see them fit themselves that they might make no discord. Da Cruz, who is the Dominican priest at the time, Da Cruz and his Portuguese friends enjoyed the music so much that they asked the Cantonese players to come back the next day, this time bringing some singers with them. And the Chinese promised to do so, but they did not appear. Yet, as if they came with some instruments, they played for us a dawn song so as not to disappoint us altogether. We know from other remarks of Da Cruz that he had not been altogether without music while he was awaiting the musicians' return. for he had followed the local Cantonese customs of buying 2 eggs coated with the yolk.
Nightingales.
And yes, sorry,
That's okay.
my Amans, I get too caught up with these things. They have a snack together. These people from 300 years ago, in these snacks, and the way they shared, the way they lounged along on the edge of the beaches, and so on in Canton. And anyway, I would end up doing another book, which I won't on this. In any case, what De Cruz says was that at daybreak one morning, they came with the same instruments. The Chinese came and gave us a dawn song so as not to post us all together. Now we know from other remarks of De Cruz that he had not been altogether without music against waiting for his colleagues' return simple with to work with him. And he says that he followed the local custom of buying 2 yolks and 2 eggs and then feeding them to his friends. The smallest gift is the importantest one. And he said that this way, by having the different nightingales purchased in the market and then listened to, you sharpen their beauty of song. And as De Cruz said, the male melted himself in music, and the female responded according to the 2 birds filing December for us, as if it had been April. I think
We're being pulled off the stage.
Right.
But I want, if I can, to just read the very end of this piece, because I think it really captures so much of what we do here at Asia Society. So Jonathan writes, now that we're in a scholarly world bulging with dictionaries, glossaries, and bibliographies and have comparatively easy access to China, De Cruz and his contemporaries might seem no more than curiosities. They were scholars who were swiftly superseded by others of greater range and perspicacity or with better access to publishing houses and publicity mills. And Jonathan writes, and yet I like thinking about these 2 men, and reading their musings, because all of us will be superseded also, one way or another, before too long. The long years of research and writing will be shown to have been fugitive or inadequate. New texts will appear or old ones be reevaluated. New topics will absorb the scholars and their readers. New approaches to the past will thrust aside the old ones. Scholarship and itself is full of a kind of barely contained craziness. We do what we can at the time we can do it, and we take our lumps or receive our rewards, or maybe both at once. If we choose to do nothing with all our research, not to write it down, weigh it, and make our thoughts public, then we're protected in a way. But it's a weak kind of protection, one that dodges the quest for true knowledge. In our reticence, we can still be watchdogs to the field, maybe even gaze serenely across the whole panorama, but we can never truly be engaged in the deepest part of the fray.
Thank you. Thank you.